The rain fell in sheets over the city that evening, drumming against the windows of Angelo's Cucina Italiana. Inside, Frank Rossi wiped down the counters one last time. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if trying to memorize the feel of the smooth marble beneath his fingers. 23 years he had owned this place. 23 years of early mornings preparing fresh pasta, of greeting regular customers by name, of celebrating birthdays and anniversaries within these walls. And tomorrow, it would all be gone. Frank glanced around at the empty dining room. The chairs were stacked neatly on tables, the floors swept clean. The framed photos still hung on the walls, pictures of his parents who had taught him to cook back in their small kitchen in Naples, newspaper clippings from when the restaurant first opened, snapshots of smiling customers from over the years. He hadn't had the heart to take them down yet. The foreclosure notice sat on the counter like an unwelcome guest. Frank had fought it for months, cutting costs wherever possible, working longer hours, even selling his car. But the combination of rising rent, a prolonged economic downturn, and a new shopping center that had diverted foot traffic from this once bustling street corner had proven too much. At least I tried, Frank whispered to himself, the words hanging in the empty air. He was about to turn off the lights when a movement outside caught his eye. Through the rain-streaked window, he could make out two figures huddled in the narrow alley beside the restaurant. They were trying to arrange what looked like pieces of cardboard into some kind of shelter against the downpour. Frank squinted through the glass. One was a man, tall and thin, wearing a tattered jacket several sizes too large. The other was much smaller, a child, Frank realized with a jolt. The man was trying to position the larger pieces of cardboard to protect the child from the rain, leaving himself exposed to the elements. Something twisted in Frank's chest. Despite everything he had lost, he still had a roof over his head, at least for tonight. The apartment above the restaurant wouldn't be his after tomorrow, but he had somewhere to go. His sister had offered her spare room until he got back on his feet. These people had nothing but wet cardboard. Without thinking twice, Frank unlocked the door and stepped out into the rain. It took only seconds for his shirt to become soaked through. "Hey!" he called out, waving to get their attention. "Hey, you two!" The man's head snapped up, his body instinctively moving to place himself between Frank and the child. His face was gaunt with several days' worth of stubble, but his eyes were clear and wary. "I'm not looking for trouble," Frank said, holding up his hands. It's pouring out here. Why don't you come inside for a bit?" The man didn't move. "We're fine," he said, his voice hoarse. "We don't want charity." "It's not charity," Frank replied. "It's common decency. And besides," he gestured to the foreclosure notice visible through the window, "this place isn't even mine after tomorrow, so technically, I'm not giving away anything that belongs to me." The man hesitated, looking down at the child, a girl Frank now saw with tangled dark hair and large eyes that seemed too old for her small face. "We could get warm, Papa," the girl whispered, though Frank could hear her clearly through the rain. "Just for a little while?" Something in the man's posture changed, shoulders slumping slightly. He nodded once, sharply, and gathered their few belongings, a backpack and what looked like a small stuffed animal wrapped in plastic to keep it dry. Frank led them inside, flipping the lights back on. The warmth enveloped them immediately, and Frank saw the little girl close her eyes for a moment, savoring it. "I'm Frank," he said, grabbing clean towels from behind the bar. "Thomas," the man replied after a moment's hesitation, "and this is my daughter, Penny." "Hi," Penny said softly, taking the towel Frank offered and wrapping it around her shoulders like a cape. "When's the last time you two ate?" Frank asked, already moving toward the kitchen. He might have lost his restaurant, but he still had food in the refrigerator, ingredients he'd planned to use for his final breakfast tomorrow. "We had some crackers this afternoon," Thomas said, his tone making it clear he didn't want pity. Frank nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "Well, I've got food that'll go bad if someone doesn't eat it. Would be ashamed to waste it." Without waiting for a response, he pushed through the swinging doors into the kitchen. This space, more than any other, had been his sanctuary for over 2 decades. Even now, with bankruptcy looming over him, the familiar environment calmed his nerves. He worked quickly, pulling out pasta, tomatoes, garlic, and the last of his prized olive oil. It wouldn't be his most elaborate meal, but food made with care was food made with care. When he returned to the dining room with a pot of water to boil at the tableside burner, he found Thomas standing awkwardly near the door as if ready to flee at any moment. Penny, however, had wandered over to the wall of photographs. "Is this you?" she asked, pointing to a faded picture of a much younger Frank, standing proudly in front of the restaurant on opening day. "Sure is," Frank said, setting up the portable burner. "That was a long time ago." "You look happy," Penny observed. Frank paused, looking at the photo. "I was. Very happy." "Why are you closing?" Thomas asked suddenly. His tone wasn't accusatory, just curious. Frank shrugged as he lit the burner. "The usual story. Bills piled up. Customers stopped coming. Tried to hold on too long instead of admitting defeat earlier." He forced a smile. "But hey, that's life sometimes. You build something, and then you watch it fall apart." Something flickered across Thomas's face. Recognition, perhaps. He nodded slightly. As the water began to boil, Frank returned to the kitchen to finish preparing the sauce. When he came back out, he found Thomas had finally taken a seat at one of the tables. Penny sat across from him, drawing patterns in the condensation on the window beside them. Frank served the simple pasta dish with as much care as he would have for paying customers in the restaurant's heyday. Old habits died hard. "It's nothing fancy," he apologized, setting the plates down. But the look on their faces as they took their first bites told him it might as well have been a feast fit for royalty. Penny's eyes widened and Thomas closed his eyes for a moment as if remembering something long forgotten. "This is amazing," Thomas said quietly. Frank waved away the compliment, but couldn't help feeling a small glow of pride. At least his final meal served in this restaurant would be appreciated. As they ate, the awkwardness between them gradually faded. Frank learned that Thomas had lost his job at a construction company 2 years ago after an injury. With no health insurance and mounting medical bills, they'd lost their apartment. They'd been staying in shelters when possible, but the past few weeks had been particularly difficult. "Penny's still in school, though," Thomas said, a note of fierce pride in his voice. "Never missed a day. The school doesn't know we're... I drop her off looking clean and with her homework done no matter what. Papa's really good at math," Penny chimed in. "He helps me even when we have to study by streetlight." The simple statement hit Frank harder than he expected. He thought of all the times he'd felt sorry for himself these past months, all while having a warm bed to sleep in every night. After they finished eating, the rain continued to pour outside, even heavier than before. Frank looked at the clock. Nearly midnight. "Listen," he said, making a quick decision. "I've got the apartment upstairs until tomorrow afternoon. There's a couch that pulls out into a bed. Why don't you two stay the night? It's too nasty out there." Thomas immediately stiffened. "We couldn't impose." "You're not imposing if I'm offering," Frank interrupted. "And honestly, I could use the company on my last night here. 23 years is a long time to say goodbye to a loan." The resistance in Thomas's eyes wavered. He looked at Penny, who was clearly fighting to keep her eyes open, exhaustion written in every line of her small body. "Just tonight," Thomas finally agreed. "And we'll be gone first thing in the morning." "Whatever you want," Frank said, knowing better than to push. He led them upstairs to his modest apartment. It was already half-packed, boxes stacked along the walls, but the furniture remained. He showed them the bathroom, found clean sheets for the pull-out couch, and gave them both t-shirts they could use as pajamas. "I'll be in the bedroom if you need anything," Frank told them. "Make yourselves at home." As he turned to leave, Penny's small voice stopped him. "Thank you for being nice to us," she said simply. "Not everyone is." Frank felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. "Well, they should be," he managed to say before retreating to his room. Later, lying awake in his bed, listening to the rain against the windows and the unfamiliar sounds of other people in his home, Frank found himself thinking about tomorrow, with slightly less dread than before. Yes, he was losing his restaurant. Yes, he was facing an uncertain future. But somehow helping these two strangers had reminded him that endings sometimes made way for new beginnings. He didn't know what the morning would bring for any of them. But for tonight at least, they all had shelter from the storm. Frank woke to the unfamiliar sound of movement in his apartment. For a moment he felt a jolt of panic before remembering his guests from the night before. The digital clock by his bed showed 6:17 a.m., earlier than he needed to be up on this final day. He lay still for a few minutes, listening to the soft footsteps and quiet voices beyond his bedroom door. Curious, he pulled on his robe and stepped into the hallway. The apartment was filled with an aroma that made him stop in his tracks. Something was cooking, and it smelled incredible. Following his nose to the small kitchen, Frank found Thomas standing at the stove, moving with surprising confidence. Penny sat at the counter, watching her father with obvious pride. "Good morning," Frank said, making both of them turn. "I hope we didn't wake you," Thomas said quickly. I wanted to thank you for letting us stay. I found some ingredients in your fridge that were about to expire, so..." Frank moved closer to see what Thomas was preparing. In one pan, eggs were cooking with what looked like the last of Frank's bell peppers, onions, and some herbs. In another, thin slices of the stale bread Frank had been planning to throw out were frying in olive oil and garlic. "You cook?" Frank asked, unable to hide his surprise. A shadow of something, pride perhaps, or maybe embarrassment, crossed Thomas's face. "I used to," he said quietly. "Before everything happened." Penny piped up, her legs swinging from the high stool. "Papa was a chef at a fancy restaurant. He made food for important people." Frank looked at Thomas with new interest. The careful way he handled the spatula, the confident flip of the bread slices. Those weren't amateur movements. "Is that right?" Frank asked. Thomas shrugged. "It was a long time ago," he said, turning back to the stove. "Breakfast will be ready in 5 minutes if you'd like some." They ate at the small kitchen table, and Frank found himself impressed, despite his years of culinary experience. Thomas had transformed Frank's ordinary ingredients into something special. The eggs were perfectly seasoned with just the right balance of herbs, and the garlic bread had a crispness that complemented the softness of the eggs beautifully. "This is remarkable," Frank said after his first few bites. "Truly. Where did you train?" Thomas hesitated, pushing food around his plate. "I started in Paris, then moved to New York for a while, worked under Chef Pierre Leblanc at La Maison for almost 5 years. Frank nearly choked on his coffee. La Maison? That place had a 3-month waiting list for reservations. 4 months usually, Thomas corrected with the ghost of a smile. At least back then. "What happened?" Frank asked before he could stop himself. "If you don't mind me asking." The kitchen fell silent. Penny looked down at her plate, suddenly very interested in her remaining food. "Life happened," Thomas said finally. "My wife got sick. Cancer. I took time off to care for her, but it wasn't enough. After she died, I couldn't find my way back to cooking, to anything." He took a deep breath. "I started drinking, lost my position, lost our apartment. By the time I pulled myself together for Penny's sake, my reputation was shot, and no one would take a chance on me anymore." Frank nodded slowly, understanding all too well how quickly life could unravel. "How long have you been—" Frank gestured vaguely, not wanting to say homeless in front of Penny. 2 years, 3 months, and 12 days, Thomas said with the precision of someone who counted each day. "We've stayed in shelters mostly, but they're often full. Some nights are rougher than others." Penny looked up. "But Papa always makes sure I get to school. I'm in 3rd grade now, and my teacher says I'm reading at a 5th grade level." The pride in her voice made both men smile. "That's impressive," Frank said sincerely. After breakfast, Thomas insisted on washing the dishes while Frank started gathering the last of his personal belongings. The bank representative would arrive at noon to take the keys. Frank worked methodically, trying to keep his emotions in check as he packed away the remnants of his life here. He was wrapping a framed photo of his parents when Thomas appeared in the doorway of his bedroom. "We should get going," Thomas said. "You've been very kind, but we've imposed enough." Frank looked up. "You don't have to rush off. I've got until noon." "We should start early if we want to check the shelter on Westbrook Avenue. The good spots fill up fast." Frank nodded, understanding the reality of their situation. He finished wrapping the photo and placed it in a box before standing up. "Listen," he said. "I've been thinking. I don't have much, but I do have a small storage unit where I'm putting some of these things. There's probably room for you and Penny to stay there for a few nights if the shelter doesn't work out. It's not ideal, but it's dry and has electricity." Thomas stiffened. "We couldn't—" I know." Frank held up his hands. "You don't want charity, but consider it payment for that breakfast. Best meal I've had in months, honestly." Before Thomas could respond, a loud crash from downstairs made them both jump. Frank hurried down to the restaurant, Thomas right behind him. They found Penny standing frozen beside a toppled chair, looking horrified at a broken picture frame on the floor. "I'm sorry," she blurted out. "I was just looking at the pictures and the chair wobbled and I tried to grab the wall." "Hey, it's okay," Frank said gently, crouching to pick up the broken glass. "No harm done." "I'll pay for it," Thomas said. Immediately, though, they all knew it was an empty promise. Frank waved him off. "It's fine. This place won't be mine in a few hours anyway." He carefully extracted the photo from the broken frame, an old newspaper clipping about the restaurant's opening. As he did, he noticed something stuck behind it, another smaller photo he had forgotten about. He pulled it out, staring at it with a sudden lump in his throat. The photo showed a much younger Frank standing with his mentor, old Giuseppe, the chef who had taught him everything he knew about Italian cooking. "Who's that?" Penny asked, peering over his shoulder. "The man who changed my life," Frank said softly. "He gave me a chance when no one else would." Something shifted in Frank's mind as he looked at the photo, then at Thomas and Penny. A crazy idea began to form. "Come with me," he said suddenly, heading toward the kitchen. "I want to show you something." He led them through the swinging doors, into the restaurant kitchen. Though partly packed up, most of the equipment remained. It belonged to the bank now. "This kitchen has been my home for 23 years, Frank said, running his hand along the stainless steel counter. "Good years, mostly, until recently." Thomas looked around appreciatively, his eyes lingering on the professional-grade oven and the hanging rack of well-maintained pots and pans. "It's a nice setup," he said. "It could be yours," Frank said. Thomas blinked. "What? Well, not yours exactly, but—" Frank took a deep breath. "What if we worked together? The bank is taking the building, but they haven't found a buyer yet. If we could convince them to lease it back to us with a new business model—" "Us?" Thomas repeated. "Frank, I appreciate the thought, but I have nothing. No money, no credit, nothing to offer." "You have talent," Frank countered. "I saw it this morning. And I have experience running a restaurant, plus some savings my sister's been holding for me. It's not much, but it might be enough to negotiate a small business loan if we had a solid plan." Thomas shook his head. "You're not thinking clearly. You're emotional because you're losing your place." "Maybe," Frank admitted. "Or maybe I recognize an opportunity. My restaurant failed because I couldn't adapt. I kept doing the same old thing, while the neighborhood changed around me. But with your skills, your background in fine dining and my knowledge of this area, we could create something new, something this neighborhood hasn't seen before." Penny, who had been quiet, suddenly spoke up. "Like a second chance?" Both men looked at her. "That could be the name," she continued, warming to the idea. "Second chance. Because you'd both get one." A moment of silence followed her words. Then Thomas laughed, a rusty sound as if he hadn't used it in a long time. "You're both crazy," he said, but there was a warmth in his voice that hadn't been there before. Frank grinned. "Maybe, but sometimes crazy works." He extended his hand. "What do you say? Should we at least talk to the bank before they kick me out of here?" Thomas hesitated, looking around the kitchen again. Then his eyes settled on Penny, who was watching him with hope plain on her small face. "Just talk," he said finally. taking Frank's hand. I'm not promising anything beyond that. That's all I'm asking for, Frank replied. As they shook hands, Frank felt something he hadn't experienced in months, a flicker of hope. Maybe this was madness. Maybe it would end in failure. But for the first time since receiving that foreclosure notice, he felt like he was moving forward instead of just watching his life crumble around him. And judging by the look on Thomas's face, he wasn't the only one. The bank representative was a woman named Gloria Chen. She arrived precisely at noon, briefcase in hand, her expression professionally neutral as she entered Angelo's Cucina Italiana. Frank had been waiting for her, sitting at one of the tables with a folder of his own. "Mr. Rossi," she said, extending her hand. "I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances." Frank shook her hand. "Thanks for coming, Ms. Chen. Before we finalize everything, I was hoping we could discuss a possibility." Gloria's eyebrow raised slightly. "A possibility?" "A new business proposal," Frank said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Would you mind sitting for a few minutes?" She hesitated, then checked her watch and nodded. "I can spare 10 minutes, but I should warn you that the foreclosure is final. The bank has already processed the paperwork." "I understand," Frank said. "I'm not trying to keep my old restaurant. I'm proposing something new." As Gloria took a seat, the kitchen doors swung open. Thomas emerged carrying 3 cups of coffee on a small tray. He had showered and changed into some of Frank's clean clothes, which were slightly too big for his lean frame. Still, he looked transformed from the desperate man Frank had found in the alley just yesterday. "This is Thomas Wilson," Frank said. "He's a chef, trained in Paris and formerly of La Maison in New York." Gloria accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks but looked confused. "I don't understand what this has to do with the foreclosure, Mr. Rossi." Frank opened his folder and slid several papers across the table. "This is a business proposal for a new restaurant concept. We're calling it Second Chance." Thomas remained standing beside Frank, his posture straight but his eyes watchful, as if expecting rejection at any moment. "The issue wasn't the location," Frank continued. "This neighborhood is actually growing. The problem was that my traditional Italian restaurant wasn't what people here wanted anymore, but a high-end fusion restaurant with affordable prices. That could work." Gloria skimmed the papers, her professional mask slipping just a bit to reveal genuine interest. "You're proposing to lease the space from the bank?" "Yes," Frank nodded. "At market rate, but with a 3-month probationary period. If we can show profitability within that time, the lease continues. If not, the bank takes back the space, no harm done." "And your financing?" Gloria asked, cutting straight to the heart of the matter. Frank took a deep breath. "I have $15,000 in personal savings. My sister has agreed to invest another 10. It's not much, I know, but we're planning to start small. Take out only at first, minimal renovations to the space." Gloria looked at Thomas. "And your contribution, Mr. Wilson?" Thomas cleared his throat. "My skills and experience. 20 years in fine dining, including 5 as sous chef at La Maison under Pierre Leblanc." "Can you verify that?" Gloria asked. A flicker of pain crossed Thomas's face. "I can provide references, though I should warn you they may not all be glowing. I left under difficult circumstances." Gloria nodded, making a note. "And what makes you think this concept will succeed where Mr. Rossi's established restaurant failed?" Before either man could answer, a small voice spoke from the kitchen doorway. "Because they need each other." All 3 adults turned to see Penny standing there, a drawing in her hand. "My papa is the best chef ever, but he doesn't know how to run a business," she said matter-of-factly. "And Mr. Frank knows everybody in the neighborhood and how to talk to them, but his food was boring." She clapped a hand over her mouth. "Sorry, Mr. Frank." Despite himself, Frank laughed. "No, she's right. My menu hadn't changed in 15 years. Gloria's expression softened as she looked at Penny. "And who might you be?" "I'm Penny. I made this for our new restaurant." She approached the table and carefully laid down her drawing. It showed a simple logo, 2 hands clasped together with the words, second chance, written beneath them. Gloria studied the drawing, then looked back at the business proposal. Frank could practically see her weighing options, calculating risks, considering alternatives. "The bank doesn't typically entertain this kind of arrangement," she said finally. "Especially not with—" She paused, glancing at Thomas, clearly, choosing her words carefully, "with partners who have gaps in their employment history." Thomas stiffened, but Frank spoke before he could. "I understand your concern. That's why we're asking for the 3-month trial. Low risk for the bank, but a chance for us to prove ourselves." Gloria tapped her fingers on the table, thinking. "I'd need a more detailed business plan. Projected costs, menu prices, staffing needs, and some form of verification of Mr. Wilson's culinary background." "We can have that to you by tomorrow," Frank said quickly. "And I'll need to discuss this with my supervisor," Gloria added. "I can't make any promises." She gathered the papers and stood up. "I'll still need to take the keys today, Mr. Rossi. The foreclosure stands, but I'll present your proposal to my supervisor this afternoon." As Gloria headed toward the door, Penny suddenly darted forward. "Wait," she called. "You forgot something." Gloria turned and Penny held out her drawing. "For your boss, so they can see our logo." For the first time, Gloria's professional demeanor cracked completely. She smiled warmly at Penny as she accepted the drawing. "I'll make sure they see it. Thank you." After she left, the three of them stood in silence for a moment. "Well," Frank said finally, "I guess we have a business plan to write." They worked through the night in Frank's sister's apartment. Louisa Rossi, a practical woman with a kind heart, had welcomed them without question when Frank explained the situation. She'd set up the pull-out couch for Thomas and Penny, then joined them at the dining table to help work out the numbers. "You're insane," she told her brother affectionately. "But I've always said you were too stubborn to fail." By dawn, they had a detailed business plan. Thomas had created a sample menu, a fusion of his French training and Frank's Italian roots, with an emphasis on affordable luxury. Dishes that looked and tasted high-end, but used inexpensive ingredients creatively. "The key is technique," Thomas explained as they reviewed the menu items. "With the right technique, even the humblest ingredients can become extraordinary." Frank rubbed his tired eyes. "If Ms. Chen's boss approves this, we'll have exactly 3 months to make it work. 3 months to completely renovate the space, create a new menu, and build a customer base from scratch." "With what money?" Louisa asked practically. "25,000 won't get you far." "We'll start small," Frank insisted. "Takeout only at first. Minimal kitchen staff, just Thomas and me to start. We can use social media for marketing instead of traditional advertising." "And I can help," Penny chimed in. She had insisted on staying up with them, though she now leaned heavily against her father's side, fighting sleep. Thomas smoothed her hair. "Yes, you can. But right now, you need to rest." He scooped her up and carried her to the pull-out couch, tucking her in, before returning to the table. "Frank," he said quietly, "I need to be honest about something." Frank looked up from the business plan. "What is it?" "I haven't cooked professionally in over 3 years. What if I can't do it anymore?" The vulnerability in Thomas's voice struck Frank. This proud man who had endured homelessness and fought daily to keep his daughter in school was afraid of failing at the one thing he had once excelled at. "Cooking isn't something you forget," Frank said firmly. "It's like riding a bicycle. Your hands remember even if your mind doubts." Thomas didn't look convinced. "Look," Frank continued, "that breakfast you made yesterday, with practically nothing to work with, that wasn't luck or a fluke, that was skill." He leaned forward. "I believe in you. Now you need to believe in yourself." Before Thomas could respond, Frank's phone rang. He checked the screen, unknown number, and answered, cautiously. "Mr. Rossi, this is Gloria Chen." Frank put the phone on speaker. "Yes, Ms. Chen, you're on speaker with my partners." "I've spoken with my supervisor," she said, her voice crisp and professional again. "The bank is willing to consider your proposal, with conditions." Frank and Thomas exchanged looks of cautious hope. What conditions? Frank asked. First, we need proof of funds for the initial investment. Second, verification of Mr. Wilson's employment history. And third, we can only offer a 2-month probationary period, not 3. 2 months, Frank repeated, the timeline suddenly seeming impossibly short. Yes. If you can show profitability within 2 months, we'll convert to a standard 3-year commercial lease. If not, the bank reclaims the property with no obligation to reimburse any improvements you've made. Frank looked at Thomas, silently asking the question. Thomas took a deep breath and nodded. We accept, Frank told Gloria. When can we get started? The paperwork will be ready tomorrow. Assuming everything checks out, you could have access to the property by the end of the week. After the call ended, a stunned silence fell over the table. We did it, Frank said finally. We actually did it. Not yet, Thomas cautioned. We still have to make it work. Louisa stood up, stretching. Well, you two have a lot of planning to do. But right now I'm making breakfast, and then you're both getting some sleep. You can't start a restaurant if you're dead on your feet. She moved to the kitchen. Frank looked at Thomas. Are you ready for this? Thomas glanced at his sleeping daughter, then back at Frank. No, he admitted with a small smile, but I'm going to do it anyway. For her. For both of us. Frank nodded, understanding completely. Sometimes the most important journeys began with a leap of faith, and sometimes the most unexpected partnerships created the strongest foundations. Their second chance was just beginning. 2 weeks after signing the papers with the bank, Frank stood in the half-renovated kitchen of what would soon be Second Chance. Dust covered every surface, and the constant sound of hammering echoed from the dining area where Thomas was removing the last of the old decorations. They had decided to handle most of the renovations themselves to save money, working from dawn until well after midnight every day. Frank wiped sweat from his forehead, leaving a streak of dust across his skin. His muscles ached from hauling equipment and scrubbing years of grease from hard-to-reach corners. But despite the exhaustion, a sense of purpose energized him. This place was becoming something new, something that belonged to both of them. How's it coming with that stove? Thomas called, appearing in the doorway with a toolbox. Almost done, Frank replied, tightening the last connection on the gas line. We got lucky that the previous owner, me, maintained it so well. Thomas smiled, a sight that had become more common in the past 2 weeks. I brought these, he said, pulling a stack of papers from his back pocket. The menu, revised again. I've narrowed it down to 15 items to start with. Frank accepted the papers, scanning the elegant yet simple descriptions. Thomas had a gift for making ordinary ingredients sound extraordinary. Pan-seared local whitefish with brown butter sauce and caramelized root vegetables. Frank read aloud. This is the frozen tilapia from Costco and those carrots and parsnips on sale at the market, isn't it? Thomas nodded, not the least bit embarrassed. It's all in the preparation and presentation. Trust me. And Frank did trust him. Over the past 2 weeks, Thomas had prepared sample dishes in Louisa's kitchen, testing recipes and techniques. Each creation had been more impressive than the last, confirming what Frank already suspected. Thomas wasn't just a good chef. He was exceptional. Hey, you two, look what I made. Penny's voice rang out as she bounded into the kitchen, carefully carrying a large piece of poster board. At Frank's insistence, she had been enrolled in the local elementary school, using Louisa's address. After school each day, she came to the restaurant to help in whatever ways a 9-year-old could. She held up the poster proudly. It was a colorful advertisement for Second Chance, featuring hand-drawn images of food and people smiling. Across the top, in careful letters, she had written, "Everyone deserves a second chance. Grand opening next week." Next week? Frank exchanged a glance with Thomas. That's optimistic. But not impossible, Thomas said, studying the kitchen. The health inspector is coming Thursday. If we pass, we could do a soft opening on Saturday. Takeout only, limited menu. Frank considered this. Their timeline was already tight, with barely 6 weeks remaining in their 2-month probationary period. They needed to start generating income soon. Okay, he agreed. Let's aim for Saturday, but we'll need to finish the front counter and point-of-sale system before then. Penny beamed, delighted that her timeline had been accepted. I'll make more posters. Can I hang them up around the neighborhood? That's a great idea, Frank said. But take Aunt Louisa with you when you do, okay? As Penny skipped off to find more art supplies, Thomas lowered his voice. Have you checked our accounts lately? How are we doing? Frank's expression tightened. We're cutting it close. The equipment repairs cost more than expected, and the permits took a bigger chunk than I planned for. Do we need to reconsider some of the renovations? Thomas asked, looking around at the partially completed kitchen. No, Frank said firmly. We're doing this right. If we're going to succeed, we need proper equipment and a space people want to visit. He managed a smile. Besides, your cooking deserves the right showcase. Thomas looked like he wanted to argue, but was interrupted by a loud crash from the dining area, followed by Penny's alarmed cry. They rushed out to find a section of ceiling had collapsed, sending plaster and debris onto the newly installed counter. Penny stood frozen a few feet away, eyes wide. Are you okay? Thomas asked urgently, checking her for injuries. I'm fine, she said, her voice small. I wasn't standing under it. Frank stared at the damage, a sinking feeling in his stomach. He climbed carefully onto the counter to examine the ceiling, poking at the surrounding areas with a broom handle. Water damage, he announced grimly. Looks like a leak from the apartment upstairs. He tapped more of the ceiling, watching as small pieces crumbled away. And it's not just this section. The whole thing needs to be replaced. Thomas's face fell. How much will that cost? Frank did some quick mental calculations. At least $3,000 for materials and labor. Maybe more if there's damage to the electrical wiring. We don't have $3,000 to spare, Thomas said quietly. They stood in silence, looking at the mess. Their tight budget had just become impossible. Maybe we can fix it ourselves? Penny suggested hopefully. Frank shook his head. This is beyond us, kiddo. We need a professional. That evening, after sending Penny home with Louisa, Frank and Thomas sat at one of the half-finished tables surrounded by renovation debris and fading hope. We could try to get a loan, Frank suggested, though he knew it was unlikely. His credit was still damaged from the bankruptcy, and Thomas had no credit at all. Or we could open without fixing it, Thomas countered. Just rope off this section and use the rest of the dining area. The health inspector would never approve that, Frank said, rubbing his tired eyes. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of their setback hanging heavy between them. I could go back to construction, Thomas said finally. Try to pick up some day labor jobs. It wouldn't be much, but no, Frank interrupted. Your place is here in the kitchen. We'll figure something out. Before Thomas could respond, the front door chimed. They had installed a bell just yesterday, though the closed sign was clearly visible. A tall woman with silver-streaked hair stepped inside, looking around with interest. Sorry to intrude, she said. I saw the lights on and got curious. I own the bookstore across the street. Frank stood, trying to hide his disappointment at the interruption. We're not open yet. Still renovating, as you can see. The woman nodded, her eyes taking in the fallen ceiling and the dust-covered counter. I can see that. I'm Vivian Howard, by the way. My shop has been here for 15 years. She extended her hand. Frank Rossi, he replied, shaking her hand. This used to be my Italian restaurant, Angelo's. Now my partner Thomas and I are opening something new. Thomas stood and introduced himself as well. I heard about that, Vivian said. The neighborhood was sorry to see Angelo's go, but we're excited about something new. She glanced up at the damaged ceiling. Looks like you've hit a snag, though. Frank sighed. Bit of a water leak issue. Nothing we can't handle. The lie fell flat even to his own ears. Vivian gave him a knowing look. Water damage is serious business. I had a pipe burst in my storeroom last winter, nearly wiped me out. How did you manage? Thomas asked, The neighborhood pitched in, she said simply. We've been here a long time, most of us. We look out for each other. Frank nodded politely, though he didn't see how this helped their situation. Anyway, Vivian continued. The real reason I stopped by, I saw the posters your little girl was putting up with Louisa. They mentioned a grand opening next week. That might be delayed now, Frank admitted, gesturing to the ceiling. Well, whenever it happens, I wanted to talk to you about catering a book club event I host monthly. We usually order from that chain sandwich place, but I'd much rather support a local business. Despite his discouragement, Frank felt a flicker of interest. How many people? About 25. Nothing fancy needed. Just some nice appetizers, maybe a few specialty items to showcase what you can do. Thomas spoke up. We'd be happy to discuss that once we're up and running. Vivian smiled. Excellent. And one more thing. I'm also the president of the Westbrook Business Association. We meet tomorrow evening. You should come, both of you. She looked meaningfully at the damaged ceiling. The association has an emergency fund for member businesses, for situations exactly like this. Frank blinked in surprise. But we're not members. You would be if you showed up tomorrow. Vivian said with a wink. 7 o'clock at the community center, don't be late. She headed toward the door, then turned back. Oh, and bring some food samples if you can. The committee votes with their stomachs as much as their heads. After she left, Frank and Thomas looked at each other. Do you think that's for real? Thomas asked. This emergency fund? I don't know, Frank admitted, but right now I'd try just about anything. The next evening, they arrived at the community center with a carefully packed cooler of samples, Thomas's signature appetizers prepared in Louisa's kitchen. Frank felt oddly nervous, like a student at a new school. The meeting room was filled with about 30 people, all business owners from the neighborhood. Some Frank recognized as former customers, others were complete strangers. Vivian waved them over, introducing them around the room. Everyone, she announced once the meeting began, I'd like you to meet Frank Rossi and Thomas Wilson. They're opening a new restaurant called Second Chance in the old Angelo's space. There were nods of recognition and a few friendly smiles. As some of you may have heard, Vivian continued, they've hit a bit of a setback with some ceiling damage. I've invited them here tonight to apply for assistance from our emergency fund. An older man near the front frowned. The fund is for established businesses, Vivian. They haven't even opened yet. Frank has been part of this neighborhood for over 20 years, Vivian countered. And their situation is exactly why we established the fund. Unexpected emergencies that could sink a small business. The discussion continued with opinions divided. Frank and Thomas distributed their food samples, which were received with appreciative murmurs and compliments. Finally, a vote was called. Frank held his breath as hands were raised around the room. It's decided then, Vivian announced with a smile. The association will provide a grant of $2,000 and organize a volunteer day this Sunday to help with repairs. She turned to Frank and Thomas. Welcome to the neighborhood. Again. As they walked back to the restaurant that night, cooler empty and spirits lifted, Thomas shook his head in disbelief. I'm not used to people helping like that, he admitted. Not anymore. Frank nodded, understanding. That's the thing about neighborhoods like this. They're like family, frustrating sometimes, but there when you need them. Speaking of family, Thomas said, his voice growing serious, I want to thank you, Frank, for everything you've done for Penny and me. No matter what happens with the restaurant, you've already given us something invaluable. What's that? Frank asked. Thomas looked up at the night sky, then back at Frank. Hope. You gave us hope again. Frank felt a lump form in his throat. Well, he said after a moment, let's make sure that hope pays off. We've got a ceiling to fix and a restaurant to open. They continued walking, their path a little clearer than it had been that morning. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time it felt like they weren't walking it alone. 6 weeks later, Frank stood at the entrance of Second Chance, watching as customers filled nearly every table in the dining room. What had begun as a takeout-only operation had quickly expanded to include dine-in service as word spread about the extraordinary food being served at the modest establishment. The renovated space barely resembled the old Angelo's. Gone were the red checkered tablecloths and candles in Chianti bottles. Instead, the walls were painted a warm cream color, adorned with pennies framed artwork depicting various second chances, from sprouting seeds to rebuilding homes. Simple wooden tables gleamed under soft lighting, and the ceiling, once their biggest crisis, now featured a beautiful mural of a night sky that Vivian's artist niece had painted as a gift. "Table 5 is asking for the chef," said Louisa, who had left her office job to help manage the front of house. "They want to compliment him personally on the duck confit." Frank smiled. "Tell them he'll be out in a moment." He headed to the kitchen, where Thomas was expertly plating the evening's special, a dish that looked like it belonged in a high-end restaurant but cost less than most fast food meals. "You have fans at table 5, Frank told him. "They're requesting an audience." Thomas looked up, his confidence in the kitchen now extending beyond the food. "Let me finish these plates first." Frank watched as Thomas added the final touches. To each dish, a small drizzle of sauce here, a sprinkling of herbs there. His hands moved with the precision of an artist, transforming simple ingredients into works of culinary art. It was hard to believe this was the same man Frank had found huddled in an alley with his daughter just 3 months ago. "Order up," Thomas called, and one of their 2 waiters, college students from the neighborhood, hurried over to collect the plates. Thomas wiped his hands on his apron and stepped out from behind the line. "Okay, which table?" Frank led him to table 5, where an older couple sat finishing their meal. The woman's eyes lit up when she saw Thomas. "Are you the chef?" she asked. When Thomas nodded, she continued, "This is the best meal we've had in years. We drove 40 minutes to get here after our daughter told us about this place." Thomas thanked them with genuine warmth. These moments still surprised him, people appreciating his food, his art, his passion. "Would you tell us how you make the sauce?" the husband asked. "It's incredible." "Trade secret," Thomas replied with a wink, but then leaned in and shared a few tips about balancing flavors and reducing stocks properly. As Thomas chatted with the couple, Frank spotted Gloria Chen entering the restaurant. She had been a regular visitor over the past weeks, monitoring their progress for the bank. Today, however, she wasn't alone. An older man in an expensive suit accompanied her. "Mr. Rossi," Gloria greeted him. "This is Mr. Patterson, the regional manager for the bank." Frank shook the man's hand, trying not to betray his nervousness. Tomorrow marked exactly 2 months since they had signed the agreement, the end of their probationary period. "I've heard good things about your establishment," Mr. Patterson said, glancing around the busy dining room. "Ms. Chen has been quite impressed with your progress." "We've been lucky," Frank said modestly. "The community has been very supportive." "Luck has nothing to do with it," Gloria interjected. "It's been hard work and smart business decisions." She smiled slightly. "And exceptional food." "Well, we'd like to see that for ourselves," Mr. Patterson said. "Do you have a table available?" Frank led them to the last open table, the one they kept reserved for walk-ins, and signaled to Louisa. She hurried over with menus and water, giving Frank a questioning look. He gave her a subtle nod, and she understood immediately the importance of these particular guests. Back in the kitchen, Frank pulled Thomas aside. "The bank manager is here with Gloria. This is it, our final evaluation." Thomas took a deep breath. "What should we serve them?" "Everything," Frank said. "Let's show them the best we have to offer." For the next hour, they sent out a parade of dishes, small portions of their most popular items, each more impressive than the last. From the kitchen, they watched as Mr. Patterson's initially reserved expression gradually transformed into one of enjoyment and then outright enthusiasm. After the desserts had been cleared, Frank approached their table. "I hope everything was satisfactory." Mr. Patterson dabbed his mouth with a napkin. "Mr. Rossi, in my 30 years with the bank, I've had to evaluate many businesses. Rarely have I been so pleasantly surprised." He gestured to the busy restaurant around them. "You've created something special here." Frank felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. Does that mean the bank will be converting your arrangement to a standard 3-year lease as agreed? Mr. Patterson confirmed. Ms. Chen will bring the paperwork tomorrow. Thank you, Frank said, meaning it. We won't let you down. After they left, Frank rushed back to the kitchen where Thomas was anxiously waiting. We did it, he announced. 3-year lease starting tomorrow. The kitchen staff, just 4 people including themselves, erupted in cheers. Thomas closed his eyes briefly, as if letting the reality sink in. Where's Penny? Frank asked. She should hear the good news too. Homework corner, Thomas replied, pointing to the small alcove they had set up near the office where Penny could do her schoolwork during dinner service. They found her bent over a notebook, her tongue sticking out slightly as she concentrated on a math problem. She looked up as they approached, immediately reading their expressions. Did we win? She asked simply. Frank laughed. Yes, kiddo. We won. Second chance is officially here to stay. Penny jumped up and threw her arms around her father, then Frank. I knew it. I just knew it would work. As the evening wound down and the last customers departed, the small staff gathered around one of the tables for their nightly family meal, a tradition Thomas had started where they all ate together after closing. Louisa raised her glass of sparkling cider. To Second Chance, the little restaurant that could. Everyone clinked glasses, laughing and sharing stories from the evening. Frank watched Thomas across the table, noting how much healthier he looked now. Cheeks filled out, eyes bright, shoulders relaxed. You know, Frank said quietly as the others chatted. We never discussed what happens next. With the apartment, I mean. Thomas and Penny had continued staying with Louisa these past months, saving every penny for the restaurant. I've been thinking about that, Thomas admitted. With my share of the profits, I should be able to get us a small place soon. Nothing fancy, but... Or, Frank interrupted, you could take the apartment upstairs. It comes with the lease, and it's just sitting empty since I moved in with Louisa. He shrugged, trying to make it seem casual. It would be convenient, being right above the restaurant. Thomas stared at him. Frank, that's too much. You've already... It's not charity, Frank said firmly, having anticipated this response. It's practical. Early mornings, late nights, being upstairs just makes sense, and... He smiled. It would be nice knowing there's someone keeping an eye on the place overnight. Before Thomas could respond, Penny tugged at her father's sleeve. Does this mean I can paint my room any color I want? She asked, clearly having overheard. Thomas looked at his daughter, then back at Frank. The resistance in his expression softened. Any color except neon green, he told her with a small smile. That gives me headaches. Deal, Penny exclaimed, already planning her decorations. Later that night, after everyone else had gone, Frank and Thomas sat at the bar, sharing a quiet moment with cups of coffee. I've been thinking, Thomas said, about ways to give back. Frank raised an eyebrow. We're barely profitable after 2 months, and you're already thinking about giving back? Thomas nodded. What if we did a special dinner once a month? For people who can't afford to eat here normally. People who are... He hesitated. Where Penny and I were. Frank considered this. We could do it on Mondays when we're normally closed. Keep costs low by using weekend leftovers creatively. Exactly, Thomas said, warming to the idea. And maybe eventually we could offer cooking classes, job training for people trying to get back on their feet. The Second Chance program, Frank mused. I like it. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, looking around at what they had built together. You know, Frank said finally, when my restaurant failed, I thought it was the end. I never imagined. It was just making way for something better. Thomas nodded. Sometimes you have to lose everything to find what you really need. Frank raised his coffee cup. To second chances. Thomas clinked his cup against Frank's, and to whatever comes next. Outside, the neon sign they had installed just last week glowed warmly in the darkness. 2 hands clasped together beneath the words Second Chance, just as Penny had drawn it that first day. Below, in smaller letters, where every meal tells a story, and what a story it was.